So I am pleased to introduce you all to our second session in our introductory dialogue series. And so today it'll be the Democracy Socrates Cafe. Our presenter is Dr. Phillips. He's the founder. He's also a critically acclaimed bestselling author, a noted scholar, a specialist in the Socratic Method. And I sent this in advance, or it was also on the website link, but these are the two websites to learn more about his work, and I'll send that as a follow-up as well. I do want to remind you all, the deadline was the 27th, the 17th. However, we still have additional funding from this Z. Smith Reynolds grant that we received. So if your campus would like a civil discourse and dialogue mini grant, so there's $700. The idea is that one of these methods that we have been promoting, you might recall that we have historically done deliberative dialogue at our Civic Engagement Institute in February. We introduced 6 other models. Through these calls, we're introducing additional models. And so if you do want to actually begin to implement some of this, this is a year-long grant. It's not just the fall, which is, unpredictable for all of us. But the minimum is that you would have 4 sessions related to dialogue. So one of those could be training. The others could be dialogues. They could be virtual. They could be in person. So if anyone after this call is interested in the funding, let me know immediately, because again, the deadline was last week, but I have a little extra money. And then I'm pleased to announce that another session, it may not be our third, because I think there's one that's going to be in between, but I want you to please save the date for Bring It to the Table. So I don't know how many of you have seen it's actually a film, and it's a model where people come to the table with someone who's of the opposite political persuasion, and they have conversations through a model. And so we'll actually be watching the video together, and then we're gonna have the creator of this model with us. And then finally, just a reminder, our network meetings are coming up, and they're about cultivating high quality community partnerships with a focus on racial equity. So if you haven't registered, go to our website, nccampuscompact.org, and do that. And so now I am going to stop sharing, and I am going to turn it over to Chris Phillips. And we are recording.
Awesome.
Well, I never made that. Hi, everybody. How you doing? It's a real honor.
Doing all right.
It's an honor to be invited to do this. I'm very grateful to Leslie for reaching out to me in these interesting times. I have been doing dialogue projects, inquiry initiatives since 1996. The first thing I started was something called Socrates Cafe. I come by it honestly. I have Greek U.S. citizenship, and I was all of this was instilled in me at a very young age before I was even ready to appreciate it by my Greek grandmother, who became the first teacher of Greek language and culture in the Tampa Bay region after her family came through Ellis Island in the 1920s. But I'll go into more about me and what I do later, but there's hundreds of Socrates Cafe and Democracy Cafe groups around the world. And if you go to our socratescafe.com/democracycafe.org site, there's a drop-down list of all the groups. Most of them are meeting now on Zoom. But when you consider the fact that my grandiose plan had been to just have one, where I was living in Montclair, New Jersey at the time, and then thanks to some serendipity, a feature in the New York Times and a feature in Public Radio International by reporters who just happened to be walking home, and they passed by our cafe gathering, and they just stared and looked inside to see what was going on. It's really been quite something, because I never did have a really grand, much less grandiose plan. And amazingly, after 24 years, it still has a momentum, and it's been expanding globally, becoming more and more of a grassroots phenomenon that's expanded globally. Most recently, it's been burgeoning throughout the Middle East. My book was just recently published by a prominent publisher in Arabic, and that's really helped it take off there. But so this workshop is all about exploring through the Socrates Cafe, Democracy Cafe way, exploring and inquiring in the way that we've been doing it for quite a long time now. And this isn't in any way, shape, or form to say that this is the way. This is one way. And hopefully it supplements and complements a lot of other kindred ways of doing things. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on this version of the Socratic method that I use and how and whether it's contributing to the democratic enterprise. And we'll go into a little bit more about that later. What I'd like to do rather than talk is have a few mini explorations with you to give you a sense of what this can be. And you can either just participate by raising the icon, the emoji, the thing that says raise your hand, or just raise your hand. What I would like to do is just kind of throw out a question with you and just give you a little bit of a taste of what this might amount to. So how do I go to the next slide? Okay. Okay, so first I'd like to, let me see if I can get them in a grid. And then...
But you won't see everybody.
Sí, amor. Pero puedo expandir, ¿no? Pero muchas gracias. So I'd like to ask you, what in your view, don't worry about right or wrong or anything like that, what do the best questions do? What do the best questions accomplish in your view? Who would like to just give me an insight or initial thought about that? Yes, Martin. Oh, Martin, you're on mute, so let's get you.
There we go.
And could you introduce yourself to me while you're...
Sure. So I am a cultural anthropologist, a China specialist, and I teach at Appalachian State University. And I've thought about this a lot. I think that one of the things so often that we do in the classroom is we ask a question to which we know the answer. And for me, a really engaging question is one that's meaningful, one that we do not necessarily know the answer to. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some, I study sociolinguistics, so there's a lot of writing on discourse analysis and types of question asking. But I think it's really important, for one thing, to ask a question that's a real question, one to which we really don't know the answer.
So can you give me an example of one that you've posed?
I can. The one that I love to ask is a huge question, but unsolved, and that is why human beings went from being egalitarian to having hierarchy at 6,000 years ago. And there are a number of different theories. It's not resolved. Mm-hmm. And I find that, I mean, obviously I'm talking you didn't ask the pedagogical context, but I find that students will say that they really love having a question where there's no right answer and where they really get to engage and look at the data and answer one way or another way, or come up with their own ideas, which I actually have them do, quite ambitious.
That's beautiful.
I like it.
Yes, I actually give workshops at universities around the country on how to ask questions that you don't know the answer to.
That's great.
Get some leaning in. The other thing is I teach a course called Deliberative Democratic Traditions, and you probably know of the tradition of Canton in China, which translates as heart to heart. At the very subversive, under the radar screen local level, they engage in this kind of inquiry that's extraordinarily democratic at the very micro level, which is a beautiful thing.
That's true.
So there are a few responses in the chat.
Okay, in the chat. Where's the chat? So we don't see the chat.
Okay, I can read it. So Patty says the best questions.
Oh, here we go.
You see it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the best questions lead you to look at an idea, practice, assumption in a new way. They also make you look both inside and outside yourself. Patty, where are you? Let's see. And Patty, can you introduce yourself to me a
Sure.
little bit?
Hi, everybody. Patty Clayton. I'm in Cary, North Carolina, right outside of Raleigh. Been working with Leslie and several of the other folks here for some time now on community campus engagement. Good to be here.
Patty, that's so beautiful how you put that. Can you give me an example of a question like that that's been that for you?
She's muted.
Oh, Patty, you're muted. I don't know how. Ask to unmute.
Muted because I'm thinking. I'll have to think
Oh,
of
okay.
it.
No, it's a beautiful thing.
There's also noise here, so I'm going to stay muted when I'm not talking.
I don't mean to put you on the spot. It's beautiful.
This isn't a specific question, but related to what Martin was saying. I draw on Parker Palmer's work, the Center for Courage and Renewal, and they talk about open, honest questions.
Yes.
And those are, I think, not only questions that you don't know the answer to, questions that aren't supposed to guide the listener somewhere, but that also means a question that the recipient of the question has to connect sort of her own priorities or assumptions to something outside of herself sometimes. Why questions.
Is there anyone that's on your mind these days that you think, if we explored it, might really be paved dirt in the idea of practice assumptions in a new way? Where's that? Because I totally agree with you. It's it truly is. Well, let me come back. And now, Susan, you said the best question. Susan Jakes, can you introduce yourself?
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Susan Jakes. I'm at NC State University, and I lead the extension program in community and rural development, and I'm a psychologist by training.
Now, you said the best questions provoke more questions. Tell me about that.
Well, if I knew you were going to put us on the spot.
Oh, is that what I'm doing? I don't want to do that. Yes, I do.
No, I think for me, and I can't give an example of this, and my brain is, we're trying to distribute 1 million masks to farm workers across the state, so that's where my brain has been, and I'm here to kind of try to transition my brain to this space. But I think a question that makes you kind of challenge your assumptions, which I think Patty said too, but makes you suddenly go, okay, I wonder why I wonder that, and then I'm starting to wonder other things, and start to have more questions. And I've had that happen to me on several times. I should probably write down when that happens, because I just turned 50 and I can't remember any of it, but that's something that I find inspiring.
That's beautifully put. I think that I was just before the pandemic struck, I was back at Quinnipiac University for I had inaugurated a Socrates Cafe, Democracy Cafe there 10 years ago, and they wanted to have me back. And one of the students said, I'm afraid to ask questions, because when I was in first grade, I wanted to ask why, and my teacher finally just told me to be quiet. She said I wasn't trying to be in any way bothersome, but I was complimenting my teacher. Her responses generated more questions in me, and she got upset with me. And she said, ever since that experience, here's an 18-year-old child, her first week at college, said, since that experience, she's been afraid to ask questions.
Wow. Yeah.
And so it's an interesting, Graham Bullock, Christopher, if you can share at some point a link about the child. Oh, yeah. Here's what I'll do, Graham. I'll send to Leslie a bunch of different things, including our facilitator's guide and an essay that I wrote about that gives more scholarly background about what we're doing. And then she can share it with all of you. And I'll actually send you the syllabus of my course, Deliberative Traditions and Democracy, that I taught at Christopher Newport University. Chris,
I think you may have missed Ruby's response.
Yes, Ruby. Can you introduce yourself? Ruby, and you're on mute. Let's get
I don't
Ruby,
know if
let's get
she
Ruby
can
off
unmute.
of mute.
Oh,
Okay.
no, you mute.
Oh,
Just mute
Okay.
her. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Am I on? Okay.
So
My name
Ruby-
is Ruby Messick. Yes, Ruby Messick. I serve as the Assistant Director for the Office of Community Engagement and Service at North Carolina Central University.
And you said questions should be asked to get to the spirit of truth. Tell me more about that.
I think oftentimes we avoid, as humans, we tend to avoid questions that get truly to the truth. Like if I would say, why does Black Lives matter? Why does it matter?
Is it the question
The
in and
hope
of
is that you
itself?
will get, the hope is that you will get some responses where people will think about the humanity and think about themselves and go inward and give some truths to that.
It's not tolerable. So let's, Ruby, how do we get people, including ourselves, to take a more inward turn at a time when a lot of us are pointing the finger of blame at everybody else, but not really looking at ourselves in the mirror and maybe asking how we can be more part of the solution than the problem?
You said it, just by looking at yourself, look inward. Pause, take a pause. You know, we all have a moment at some point of our life where we do get an opportunity to reassess or to assess ourselves, to look at self. As Michael Jackson said, looking at the man in the mirror. You know, you have to at some point reflect on you and begin to think about what you've become, who you are to you. Because wherever you go, you're going to find yourself in this life. And at some point you're going to meet and you're going to meet yourself, and you have to answer questions like that. When things happen, it's happening to all of us. It's not just one person or one individual. It's happening to all of us. So you have to ask why or how. Why would that happen? Does it really matter? You have to go back to self. You have to go to that center. You have to go back to your peace and find the answer, because it's there.
I think that's beautifully put. If you ever go to my Facebook page, you'll see a picture of me, and it has that quote from Michael Jackson's song, Man in the Mirror. It's one of my favorites. It's one of my all-time favorites. I can't believe you mentioned that. I've had it up there forever. Okay, well, let's go on to the next. So here's what I want to ask you now. How do I get back to that?
Well, first, you want to share the screen?
Yes, I'm going to share this next slide. So we're going to have now what I call a mini questions summit. And how do I get back to this one? So let's have a little mini question summit now. And I'm going to ask you, what is one of the most important questions that all of us should be asking right now? What to you, and again, I'm going to just, whoever wants to respond, what to you is a question that we all need to be asking and attempting to answer right now? This time of the pandemic, of Black Lives Matter, massive protests still ongoing in many places, like where I used to teach in Portland, Oregon. What is a question that you think we should all be seeking to explore and try to come up with answers to? Just one idea?
One question I have on my mind is, what does it mean to be human?
What does it mean to be human? Wow. And why is that on your mind right now?
Because for me, all of these situations we're dealing with are about humanity, about who do we see ourselves as, who do we want to be, how do we define what it means to care for neighbor, for self, for people who are different from me. It's a question of humanity for me. I just keep landing there.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Anybody else have a question that they think really needs to be explored in these times?
Chris, this is Dennis. For me, it's when I feel safe, why do I feel safe? at that moment to try and understand how can I share that, or how can I help others get to that place of feeling safe.
Thank you. Thank you. Martin, what did you have to say?
I think it's really also important to ask the question why. Why about almost anything. Obviously, Black Lives Matter. Why racism is happening? Why COVID is happening? Because if we don't ask that question, then we accept something as being semi-natural or automatic. And by asking that question, which gets asked too infrequently, I think, then we really open up an important discourse on issues that need to be discussed.
So Martin, where do you think these kinds of questions should be broached? In classrooms and in communities, at home, everywhere? Where'd Martin go? Martin, what are your...
I think, just superficially from your question to me, I would say everywhere, certainly in the classroom.
So that's, and then Patty asks, how is it human beings can be capable of both great generosity and love and great violence and cruelty and self-centeredness? How can we hold these two aspects of ourselves creatively rather than being shut down by the reality of the latter in ourselves and in others? Patty, can you tell me more about where that question comes from with you and why you consider it so vital?
I think it's the main thing that's in my head and heart these days, and it has been for some time. I feel like I'm sort of constantly in a whiplash mode between a sense of awe and wonder and appreciation at the little things that so many people are doing every day. You know, the kid who takes her piece of chalk out on the driveway and writes a happy message and reminds you to wash your hands. It's wonderful. And 5 minutes later, I'm whiplashed the other way to the short-sightedness and the cruelty and the selfishness. There's going to be a quote press conference from the White House this afternoon, and I expect that I will be whiplashed during that, back away from the 6-year-old. And so I personally, I'm just in a lot of pain being like that all the time. I'd like to be able to, again, the idea of creative tension holding, I'd like to be able to say that yes, it is a real thing, that there's violence and selfishness and cruelty and etc., and that doesn't make me cynical about our species or the human endeavor or whatever. But I think I'm getting more cynical, and I need more and more to hold on to that little 6-year-old and her piece of chalk.
You know, it's interesting. I think one of the reasons I still enjoy holding Socrates cafes and democracy cafes is questions like these great ones you're posing, is to help me realize more and more the contradictions that exist within me. It's so easy to objectively see the faults and foibles of other people. And it's so hard to see them in myself and where they reside. And at these gatherings, again, our gatherings are ongoing. They're not one-time shows. People serve as gentle mirrors into ourselves, and they help us see contradictions that exist within us, but in ways that inspire us, ideally, to bring into resolution the contradictions we have, but also then to take that next step of bringing into greater alignment our practices and our professed views. To walk that walk instead of just talking it. And that's a hard road to hoe. But why I still enjoy doing these types of gatherings after all this time is helps me become a better person. I focus less on judging others and on judging myself, and seeing what I can do to just model being that dad or community denizen, global citizen that can be a difference in my own modest way. Thank you for that. So Susan, you pose, what are those things in your life that draw you into your community to care for others? That seems just like pay dirt these days. Can you tell me a little bit more about what prompts that in you?
I think if I were to describe my life work with extension, it would be in thinking about how do you take a community and transform it from kind of inward TV watching, not really doing anything, from passive to kind of taking action. And then how do you, a couple things, channel the action to positive change, but also how do you build capacity and context for that action to be effective? So those are things I think about. And then I added at the very end to care for others. So I think another piece of that is, how do you take that kind of provoked action and turn it into something that works for the betterment of the community? I don't know, there's a lot of thoughts there, but.
They're beautiful. Are these times in particular what prompted you to ask that question?
No, I think I've been asking it for
A long time?
40 years now.
And it resonates more than ever. It definitely resonates with me. Let me read some others. Melissa said, sometimes the smallest question can be the most important, or the seemingly smallest question, why? And Gina said, my thought is that we can ask, am I interested in being a part of the solution? Why or why not? Gina, can you introduce yourself and tell us, oh, I can't see you. Can you turn your video on by any chance? Oh, there you are. Hi there. And let's see, we got to get you off of mute. There you go. Gina, tell me more about that question, please.
Well, hi. Can you guys hear me?
And introduce yourself to me.
Okay, great. So sorry about the dark background. I'll try to get a better video in just a second. But I am Regina Johnson. I am on the Community Engagement and Advisory Council at UNC Charlotte. I work in the College of Ed, and I'm super interested and passionate about community engagement, community relations, and the how-tos and the how-not-tos. So I thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you for being part of it. Tell me more about your question.
So the reason for my question is because in light of everything that's been happening, I'm finding that some people are very resistant for some reason to even want to consider how things could be different, or even why things are as bad as they are. It seems like people seem to be very polarized. They're either, pro-Republican, and I don't have to explain why, it's just the right thing to do, or no, Republicans are all wrong and we should just get them out of the offices that they serve in. And I'm thinking, okay, well, those are two perspectives. However, that's not kind of really helping us right now. So if you kind of like to see, things go quote unquote back to normal, or at least use these experiences to build a better society around us.
Yes.
Are you even interested in that? Because I wonder if you reflect on that, that may tell you something about yourself, good or bad, is my thoughts.
That's a beautiful thought. And quite often we can sort of dig in our heels and really not listen to what anybody who has an opposing view has to say.
Right.
And that's, America was built on this tradition of not just offering a view, but considering dissenting views.
Yes.
And once we lose that ability to even hear out someone who dissents or has a different perspective, that can be kind of the death knell of an open society.
Yes.
I have, as I'd mentioned, I have citizenship in both Greece and the United States, and my wife is Mexican and has U.S. citizenship. And Greece was the cradle of Western democracy, and what happened is what's happened again and again there is it had a period of ascent. People were very, very open. They felt they were all in this together. Then it reached a period of stasis and folks frankly became pretty greedy and inward. Didn't really care so much about their neighbor. And then they started these naked land grabs of other countries.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. And then there was a dissent as people turned inward and became divided, family against family, neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. And that's what led to Greece's great decline in a very simplistic nutshell. That's something that I still write about to this day. And I keep asking myself, how can I do my bit to make sure that this doesn't happen in my own beloved democracy in the United States? So I write books, for one thing. Who is Chris? So I'm a guy from Newport News, Virginia. And I was raised by a mother who was born in a coal mining camp in West Virginia, and a father whose family immigrated through Ellis Island in the 1920s and celebrated the Greek heritage. My mother's side of the family came from Essex, England, and her father was a railroad engineer, and she was raised in a coal mining camp, self-contained. So I come from two very different traditions. But the tradition that I celebrate is the questioning tradition. And so the philosophers like Socrates, very flawed and foible human being, Thomas Jefferson, whom I studied deeply when I went to the College of William and Mary and wrote a book called Constitution Cafe. I launch explorations in the US and around the globe that serve as sort of platforms and springboards to bring together very diverse people in ways that don't have us jumping down one another's throats. I've often heard that dialogue is often better achieved if we know one another better. And yet I don't know about you, but I've had many longtime friends who've unfriended one another. They've been friends for 50 years. In the last 4 years, they've gotten so upset and angry with one another that knowing one another hasn't helped them one bit. And in fact, seems it sometimes to be a disincentive to engaging thoughtfully. So I've seen the kinds of divisions and rifts that make me almost wistful for the kind of polarization that existed when I started this in the Bill Clinton era, which makes it even more incumbent upon all of us to find various ways to engage with one another continually, and in ways that even if and as we differ and part company, that make us want to come back to the table and engage with one another again and again and again. And so that's what our Socrates Cafe initiative is all about, our Democracy Cafe. And I was raised, and this is a tattoo that I have, I was raised to believe two things. The one tattoo on the right, these are Greek letters. One is called arete. And I was raised to believe that we should strive to be an excellent all-rounder. And with this ethos that I can't be all I can be unless I'm also helping my fellow humans be all they can be at the same time. How do we do that? Well, we just help each other discover our talents and potentials and where we want to dive in and contribute. And we do that in one way is through regular inquiry, whether it's questioning, whether it's painting, whether it's dancing. There's many ways of going about inquiry, writing music, singing. All of these combine quite often. So arete is a Greek word you're going to leave here learning, and the other one is meraki, which is to live a life of all-around passion, soul. And you combine those with this sense, and I have them as a tattoo to remind myself every morning that I wake up, that for me, that's what it's all about, is to strive to create a kind of excellence. We're always trying to make conditions more fertile for everybody, especially the most marginalized and powerless, to give them a seat at the table. So my wife Ceci and I have a specific focus in our Socrates Cafe, Democracy Cafe, with indigenous groups throughout Mexico and the Navajo Nation. We've had them, and their very first Socrates Cafe that was outside of like a cafe or a community center was at a shelter for abused women in Chicago called Deborah's Place. And we're just getting ready to start a new collaboration with children in southern Mexico from Mayan traditions who have been victims of family abuse. But all people have such stores of knowledge, whether they've ever set foot in the hallowed halls or not, whether they can read or not. They have rich experiences. And it behooves all of us to do all we can to get ourselves in positions where we can learn from them, where we can share one another's stories, and just use questions basically as the excuse and pretext to learn one another's stories. And that in of itself can be transformative. We can use it. And so here's a few of the books that I've written about my experiences. But it's all about that great questioning tradition that's been part of the human experience almost since its origins, but feeling that we can come together without, and what I try to do that probably differentiates Socrates Cafe and Democracy Cafe from other enterprises is we focus on exploration and inquiry. I leave it up to the gazillions of other groups to hash it out with argument and debate. I think what we need right now is to explore together and to come up with artfully framed questions that have us all leaning in and to feel like we don't know the answer, totally. Or even if we feel like we do know the answer, to actually also feel that we can learn something from our other fellow human beings. Even if and as sometimes they say things that ruffle our feathers, that we're still in that and we're gonna try to just, not just use the squishy term listening, but hear one another out in ways that we want to bring them into our world. And we want to bridge the chasms that exist between one human being and another. We probably never do it all together, but I am hopeful and heartened that after 24 years, our groups thrive and they continue to expand in very unexpected places. Sometimes they go by the wayside, but sometimes they continue to thrive. The group I started in Montclair, New Jersey, at a little sliver of a coffee house, they continue to Socratize every Tuesday night, 24 years later. And now they do it on Zoom. The groups in New Zealand and Fiji and Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, you know, they're all gathering on Zoom now. But they miss each other so much. There was a period of about 2 months of total shock. Like, what do? We can't get together now. And then one by one, we started switching over to Zoom. And now what I've discovered in our Democracy Cafe activities is that Zoom is a great platform, as are others, to bring together people from around the US and around the globe and frame questions that we feel are of import that need to be explored today. And so I invite people to send me questions I hold regular Socrates Cafe and Democracy Cafe global gatherings online. You're all invited to everyone. If you go to our blog at socratescafe.com, you'll see our latest announcements and all the access information on Zoom. But one of the questions that was pressing on participants' mind was this one, on how do we confront and overcome racism in these times? And I'm wondering, I would like one of the interest, what would you say if you got a response from a participant who said, well, I don't think we have a problem with racism today? What would that do to you? As we had a participant who felt racism wasn't a problem. And I saw a bunch of people that, get into very defensive posture. And I'm wondering, what would you do if you had a response like that? If somebody said, well, I just don't think it exists, and in my community, I don't see that, and I think it's being exaggerated. Can one or two of you share with me either on, so Cameron, you would ask them to explain why. Tell me more about that. Cameron, let's get you off mute.
I've had this actually come up before, and I would just ask them to explain why sometimes they think all this into themselves, but when they say it out loud, they can see a difference or like a reason of why someone else may have a different opinion or view. So I think asking them to explain it out loud so that they can see themselves out loud and hear it, which recollects different when you actually hear it out loud.
Would you try to convince them that their view was wrong?
Absolutely not. I think that people are entitled to their own opinion, whether it's right or wrong. Being able to have that conversation is needed. I mean, some things they may say you may not have thought of that could be true. So you can take something from that, but then hopefully that from the conversation they gain from what you're saying too.
What are some other thoughts? Thank you so much, Cameron. Some other thoughts. So Patty, you said, what would it look like in your world if you did see it? What stories have you heard from others that suggest they do experience it, and why do you think your story is different? Patty, can you tell me more about that, why that's what you would pose?
I don't think it does any good to put anybody on the defensive. I think it's often helpful to sort of get somebody thinking about the counter example of something or the flip side of something. So what would it be like if there were different conditions? And in this case, sort of getting the person herself to creatively think, well, I guess if I saw this, which then could lead her to realize she probably is seeing or experiencing or being things like this. And then the second part of the question, I find there's a lot of power in story that data or yes, but doesn't always hold. And sometimes people are open to hearing other stories. And again, sometimes then bouncing those off of their own. So just to invite somebody to remember another person's story that could be a counter example, could be sort of a gentle and personal, interpersonal maybe, way to get them to look at their own reasoning.
That's beautifully put. Any other thoughts? Anybody else? Go ahead, Graham. Get yourself off mute.
Yeah, so first of all, nice to see everyone. So I'm Graham Bullock. I'm a professor at Davidson College and working with my colleague Claire, who's also on this call on a new project called the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative, which we are struggling with these same questions. And I want to 100% agree with both Cameron and Patty's points. But then, I guess ask or think more about this point about persuasion, because I think stories are important, listening is important, but at some point, I think a goal, is to get to a point in a relationship where it is okay and acceptable to try to persuade, that you're open to be persuaded by someone else and that they're open to be persuaded by you. And I think that's really what productive, healthy politics is about, whether it's at an individual level or at a macro level. And to kind of take the negative valence away from the term persuasion, because ultimately we are all, whether we admit it or not, if we're committed to our values, we do want to persuade people. And it's inauthentic to say, oh, I'm not interested in persuading you. Of course you are. And that's okay. But it's how you do it. And you don't do it in a manipulative way where you're actually, hiding your intentions and, hiding certain information or truths. And you do it in a kind of humble and empathetic way. So that's just a thought.
So Graham, tell me about a time when you've had your mind changed.
Well, often. So, I can talk a little. I'm working on a paper right now. So, I'm a professor working on a paper with a colleague, and we are going back and forth quite a bit on the question of. It's about what is engaged scholarship, what does engaged research mean, and around definitions. What is it? What is the definition of it? And this colleague, has persuaded me of certain, kind of things to include in that, and I think I've persuaded him on some things. So that's just one.
How do we create the kind of ambiance where everybody feels like it's what I would call egalitarian, where it's not like I'm going to suddenly insert myself as a professor or as someone with a PhD, but I'm a fellow human being, and I'm going to engage you as somebody who doesn't have a degree at all as a fellow equal, where we can hear each one another out and attempt to persuade one another. Is that possible?
Well, that's why I'm on this call, to learn from you, how we can do that. But I think Cameron and Patty's points are critical to that. Like that you have to establish that connection of listening, of hearing different stories, right? And that human connection. It's easier for my colleague and I, because we're both professors, right? We're at a certain same level, or profession, and it's harder if you're coming from very different backgrounds. So it takes time, right? And commitment to doing that. And in a world where time is at such a premium, it's so hard to get people to do that when all they want to do is act, right? You know, and do stuff, whether, again, it's at a micro or macro level. But often that, if they can learn, that can be counterproductive, if they haven't established those connections. I don't know. So that's my thought.
Yes, absolutely. So are you all reading the comments that are on the screen, or do you need me to read them? You all can see them because there's some beautiful points. Maybe one take on persuade would be support someone and reach a fully informed judgment. Patty, in doing that, I've been in a lot of situations where people want to inform me, but really don't want me to inform them. How do we, again, one of the big things about what we do is to try to create an atmosphere where we're constantly informing one another, and accepting that there is always a little attempt at proselytism. Like Graham says, you have your staunchly held viewpoint, passionately held, sincerely held. But sometimes what I've encountered is that when there's somebody from a very different perspective, I can tell by people's approaches that they don't believe that person's perspective is as sincere as mine. They consider it too wacky, too just off, out into left field. And you can tell by body language and facial expressions that they don't believe that that person's view is sincerely held or as sincerely held. So what we do, one of the things that we do, and I'll go into this more, is we try to give each other the benefit of the doubt. And until and unless we really do know that person's being inauthentic, that we hear them out, and that we maybe allow ourselves to be transformed by a very, very different way of seeing things, even if and as we leave the discourse being more entrenched in our own view than ever. The mere fact that we've really allowed someone to engage with us. And if you really want to compliment somebody, ask them probing questions to follow up and help them develop their story better, even if and as you differ. The mere fact that you're curious enough to know more about their story and how their philosophy is based on their story, you're doing an extraordinary service to humanity just by really wanting to know more about them. That in and of itself can be quite transformative, and you won't leave a gathering like that unscathed. So another question that was generated with us recently that we then held a global gathering on was, how can we achieve, we held it actually, let me tell you a little bit about this. This dialogue was announced on May 25th, about 6 hours before George Floyd was killed. So we didn't do this after the fact. This was something that we celebrate each year, Juneteenth. And a question that was posed, and then if you go to our blog, you'll see that it was posed many hours before George Floyd was killed. Our board chair, Dennis Deans, lives in the Twin Cities, who's based there. And so the question that was posed and that we wanted to explore, based on the feelings and concerns and so much other sentiment, was how do we achieve absolute equality of rights? That was the question that sprang, this universal question, timeless question that sprang from a particular circumstance that for us resonated before even the tragic circumstance of George Floyd. People were, some of our groups, we have groups in Kentucky, and they were very, very upset about the tragic death of Breonna Taylor. So this has already been something that's been welling up in people's minds and hearts. But again, can you offer just a few of your thoughts about this so we can have a few of these mini dialogues? How do we achieve absolute equality of rights? The assumption is that we do. Can we? Is it something we want to do? What are some of your thoughts?
I think that it's, with this question, it's really important to get a certain amount of debate going, because it would be easy to just everyone say, yeah, equality of rights, I believe in that. But there is, of course, unfortunate, to my mind, American position that there should be equality of rights, but not economic rights. That equality means political and free speech, but it does not mean any kind of equality having to do with economics. And I think in order to make a question like this really meaningful, and in order to encourage people to disagree in a meaningful way, I would put out the American view versus the view of much of the rest of the world on this question.
So you would bring up alternative systems where, I mean, right now being discussed in the US is the notion of universal basic income, among other things.
Yeah.
And the fact that the outcomes for people who have coronavirus is much more dismal and bleak for those who are poor than for those who can seek really high quality health care. Supposedly this was all going to be addressed with the Affordable Care Act, and you're seeing that the inequalities, if anything, in many areas of the US have been exacerbated by that. Absolutely. What are, so Kimmy, you said this question makes me ask more questions. Which rights are we talking about? Which identities are we considering when thinking about rights? Kimmy, tell us more and introduce yourself to me.
Hey, I'm Kimmy Gardner, and I work with Duke Service Learning, so kind of curricular community engagement at Duke University. And I think that this question, when I just see kind of rights in general, I mean, you could kind of have the large umbrella of human rights, but I start thinking about different identities that have been historically marginalized. So I think about race, gender, sexual orientation, ability. So I think that it's such a big question of, you know, like, would it be kind of divided down and distilled down into thinking about those specific identity groups, or is it more, we talking about rights on a broader scale? So for me, it's a good question because it leads me to ask more questions that I think would, in a conversation, help clarify what different viewpoints people might have and where they'd be coming from of how they conceptualize rights.
Well, I hope you understand that what I'm doing is giving you a taste of our various Democracy Cafe and Socrates Cafe experiences. And that's what we do. We look at these things and say, well, what do we mean? What exactly are we talking about? For instance, in my other country of citizenship, Greece, whereas in a world of limited resources, the first thing that their chief healthcare officer did when the pandemic broke was he told everybody to stay at home for the sake of our senior citizens, because seniors are considered treasures there. And he got very emotional, talked about his grandmother, tears in his eyes. People stayed at home, not because it was the law, because they didn't want to get their seniors sick. And so if you look, for instance, at the outcomes in Greece, fatality rates versus Belgium, which has the same population, there have been less than 2,000 people who have died from the coronavirus in Greece because of they want seniors to have the same equality of rights, even though they're more vulnerable, than they would want people of, you know, middle age and younger ages. So it was interesting to me that in the US, our president was talking about more of, well, you know, we seniors have lived long lives, let's distribute resources more to the younger folks. But it was a real revelatory to me just to get a more sense of how others are approaching this. Sheraton, tell me more. I think it's necessary to emphasize how races and ethnicities currently don't have equal rights in the US. Can you introduce yourself and tell me more about that?
Hello, everyone. I am the North Carolina Campus Compact Liaison from Winston-Salem State University. I agree a lot with what Kimmy said, and she even got into more of the big intersectionality piece than what I just wrote, which is races and ethnicities. It's totally about identities, but I think a part of the question of how do we or can we achieve equality of rights gets to what's the current status. And, you know, that can create a lot of dialogue because depending on who you talk to, some people think that, you know, an identity has equal rights across, you know, different lives in America, which from a factual standpoint isn't true. So I think that that's a conversation to have, and it's an ongoing conversation to have, and it's a difficult conversation to have. But it would be involved in that bigger question.
And that's why it's, you know, for us, it's so important to come together again and again and again, you know, and in the matrices of time and in the spaces of time, in the interim, when we're not together, we may experience different things that give us more empathy and insight into what others are seeing and doing. Now, Patty, you've said something really interesting. Are we limiting to human rights as distinct to living beings more generally, for example? Now, that's the Hopi view. I write about that in Constitution Cafe. They wanted to write a new Bill of Rights that included all sentient beings when I engaged in a project with them. So, Patty, is that what do you think about that in the context of the question, how do we achieve absolute equality of rights?
Well, environmental philosophy is one of my interdisciplinary areas, and personally, extending ethical inquiry beyond the realm of our own species is an important thing to do. And Chris, I also want to say, I feel like I'm talking way too much. Typing helps me think, so don't feel like you have to ask me everything. I
will not. What are some others who haven't spoken yet? What are your thoughts about this? I know there's always very modest, silent souls who always have wise things to say. Can I put you on the spot, or how about anybody who hasn't said something yet? Can I get it? Would you like to share something? Gina, you wanted to say something, right?
She's muted. You're muted.
Here.
Wait, Gina, we can't hear you.
She said no, she didn't want to say anything.
Thank you for interpreting that, Leslie. No, I will.
I thought I saw you. Okay.
But Melissa did.
Melissa, how about you? Melissa, introduce
Hi,
yourself.
good afternoon, everyone. I'm Melissa Lyon. I'm at Fayetteville State University. I'm the Service Learning Program Manager there. And like with a lot of these questions and that, where everybody else has been talking about how, one of the big things is when I see this question of how do we achieve absolute equality of rights, my first instinct is to twist the question around a little bit. Do we even want to achieve the absolute equality of rights?
Okay.
And because if we don't want to achieve it, why are we even talking about it? And then it comes into, just like others were talking about, which identities are we talking about for the equality? Do the people who are feeling that they don't have equality in their rights, or that do they want that equality? And are the people who have more rights than others, are they willing to give up something to be able to establish and obtain that equality? So like others, the question leads me to more questions.
Absolutely, and those are very, very, very important points. And I'm so grateful that you did what we do at our gatherings, challenge the embedded assumptions in the question. And is it something we always want to achieve? Quite often at our gatherings, we have children and youth. And they say, well, why aren't we treated as equals? Why can't we vote? And one precocious child said, do you know in Germany, he said in Brazil, you get to vote in federal elections at age 16. And there's a movement afoot in the United States to lower the voting age in municipalities. From Tacoma Park, Maryland to Washington, D.C., to San Francisco and Berkeley, they've lowered voting ages, for instance, for school board members. So kids can vote in the things that affect their lives directly. But there are a number of adults who didn't like that. They liked the age 18 voting. Oh, kids are too impressionable. No, they just listen to their parents. And it was fascinating to hear the back and forth, but also to chip away just by challenging the assumptions of, well, who exactly are we talking about when we're exploring equality of rights? Would we be willing to lower the voting age and consider, at least in my experience, sometimes young people have far more astute, nuanced views than us older folks. They talk about children being impressionable, and then I look at the effect of negative ad campaigns on adults. And it was a fascinating discourse. Okay, we're going to move on. Just wanted to give you a taste. So here's what we've been holding gatherings now since actually before the pandemic, but we've taken it on in earnest since then on Zoom. And again, you're always welcome to take part in those with us. But we truly do have people from around the world, and it's wonderful to get global perspectives about these issues. When I think about tackling inequality and racism in the United States, many of us, including me, find it helpful to get perspectives of people from other countries and how race is impacting them or isn't impacting them, or if so, in different ways. And so the more perspectives that I can bring to the table in one of our gatherings, in which we're all in this together and we all consider one another's views equally. It doesn't mean that all views are equally right. It doesn't mean, and I need to stress this, it doesn't mean that all views are equally tenable. What it means is we equally consider them to find which views do hold water, which do pass muster, and which we can poke holes through. But you can't do that until you give genuine equal consideration to a wide range of seeing things. And that's a big part of what we do in the Socrates Cafe. We encounter one another. We encounter one another in ways that make us want to hear one another out. And more than that, help one another develop our stories, our views more than we would in a typical conversation. We keep asking why, not to stump or to threaten or just to challenge aggressively, but to out of genuine curiosity to know more about why people think the way they do and what the story is behind why they think what they think. And people see that as a true honor once they realize you're not playing stump the participant, where you're continually asking why, because you're curious, especially and even if you diverge and disagree, because the view is so alien to what you yourself has experienced. And so it can be a real thrill and a real transformative experience to come together on a regular basis with people, including people you think you know very, very well. And it turns out in the course of this kind of discourse that they may something that surprises you very much. You thought you knew them well until you had an inquiry like this with them, and you'll go, gosh, I didn't know you thought that. I've been working with you for 25 years. So that's sort of the kind of impact that we have at our Socrates Cafe and Democracy Cafe about gatherings. And they're always about values. We're always sharing values. As you reflect, if you were recording this, if you go back and look at our exchanges so far, you'll see that each and every one of you are also revealing your value systems. Where you come from, you know, a little bit about that. And that involves a bit of trust, where we have to trust one another to want to share a little bit. You know, it doesn't have to be sort of a naked confessional way, but in a way that makes us want to share and entertain other views, because that in and of itself can make us feel more connected and more amenable to reaching creative consensus and discovering common ground. So that the next time you do go into a much needed debate, a hot topic issue that you have to solve, because you've had a little bit more of these open-ended kinds of inquiries beforehand, you may well feel a greater sense of connection and connectedness with those involved. So this can be both a precursor to and a complement to other existing forums where you do have to tackle things, but you also need to get some sense of where each other's philosophies are and where there might be some matrices of agreement. But it's all about discovering further value systems. I've held this one dialogue I held was in Hiroshima, Japan. This other one I held was with kids who are home and they're bored. And we did this one in Spanish because they feel sometimes that it's their primary language and that they're left out of things just because they don't have a grasp of the great catalog of English words that they do in the Spanish language. So Ceci and I hold a lot of Spanish language inquiries with kids too, especially Ceci's from Mexico, and thanks to her, I also speak Spanish fluently now. But kids inform me, kids inform us. And so when we do talk about equal rights, I believe it's very, very important to give children a chance also. The best gatherings for me when we're holding these typically have a healthy contingent of kids. When I did this project that I wrote a book about called Constitution Cafe, I asked people in many different settings, we have these sort of mini offbeat constitutional conventions, what would you add to the Constitution or change to our Constitution if you could? And I go to this elementary school in Southeast Washington, D.C. I've been going for about 20 years now. And I asked them what they would change. And they said, well, they had done an activity in their school about the Constitution. And they said, Mr. Phillips, why doesn't the Constitution even mention the word education? And I said, well, that's a good question. And they say, well, I want that Bill of Rights to say every one of us should have the right to a quality education. And so they kept, this was when President Obama was in office. They said, I want to go to a school like President Obama's kids go to. And they wrote an amendment to the Constitution that said every child should have the right to what President Obama called a world-class education. We put it together and we mailed it to President Obama. And we got a form letter response, but somebody got it. But they wanted a world-class education. Now, you can hire teams of lawyers to examine what that would amount to in a constitutional argument. But that's what they wanted. They're thinking about these things, and they want that education so they emerge from the hallowed halls able to participate fully. And it was their idea out of the mouths of babes. But I think whenever you can, to take advantage, if you have children and youth in your orbit, sometimes you got to be a parent, sometimes you got to put hierarchies, I understand that. But sometimes just engage with them in equals, and I invite you to pose to them the same questions that we're exploring right now. But it's all about, our form of inquiry is all about building bridges. How do we build bridges instead of walls between one human being and another? Can we take another minute and just explore that question? What is your philosophy of that? How and do we want to build bridges rather than walls? What is your way of going about it, if we do? What are some thoughts? Anybody have their hand up, and I'm going to just stand? How do you build bridges? Yes, Martin.
Of course, I like the idea of building bridges, but I think we have to be careful because I think that there can be a kind of facile response that, well, we build bridges with anyone and everyone, and we respect everyone else's views. And I think that's really problematic. It's something, I mean, I'm an anthropologist, of course, I'm a relativist in many ways, but I think that vulgarized relativism gets put forth that says, well, any view is okay. And
so do you think that that's what it would amount to, Martin? That building bridges is the same as saying every view is okay?
I don't think so, but I think there are many, many people who think that, think that building bridges means that we ratify as equally valid any kind of view. And, of course, meaning that Nazism we have to accept and fascism we have to accept. And
so Martin, you're an ideal Democracy Cafe participant because that's what we do. We challenge the assumptions in these questions that are proposed. We look at differences of degree. Are we talking about all views should be considered, much less considered equal? Are there some views that are so abhorrent and such anathema that we should off the table just get them out of there? Or should we at least give it a moment's consideration beforehand? But that's exactly what we do with these inquiries. They typically last between each one of these questions that I'm posing to you in these mini gatherings. I'm just trying to give you a flavor of it. They go on for at least an hour and a half, typically. Any one of these given questions. And we look at them thoroughly, exploring them in the nuanced, colorful way, just precisely what you're offering us right now. So thank you for that. So this is what my life's calling is. It's about exploring these issues, but always making sure that young people are involved and included. I was the first senior education fellow at the National Constitution Center in Philly. And so I engage with the students at the public charter school, Constitution High, regularly on these very kinds of questions. What are we talking about when we talk about rights? What are we talking about when we talk about equal rights? Do we need to earn them? Do I want the right to vote when I'm 10, or do I need to go through certain hoops of citizenship and participation before I would even want to have that right to vote? These are things that are explored thoroughly and on a regular basis with people. Now, one of the more interesting discourses that we had was when we look at our Constitution is the president's right to pardon, which has been getting a lot of play these days. And a lot of people feel like the president shouldn't have that power like a king to just decide who should be pardoned no matter what, that there should be some check and balance, because that's what our constitutional republic is supposed to be all about, is having checks and balances. And if a president can, or a governor can pardon anyone they want, federal law or state, conviction, then what does that say about, do we really have a democracy if someone can say you are pardoned, and that's to be done with it? But these are the hard things that we look at and how we might want to change our system. So it's all about a forward-looking thing. What we do, my first children's book was called The Philosophers Club. I started outreach in the Mission District of San Francisco, California, where Ceci, my wife, was a school teacher. And we found that many children whose families risked their lives to cross the Sonora Desert to live in San Francisco, and they didn't have a great grasp of the 3 R's. And so I, as a volunteer, began bringing them into the library twice a week to hold inquiries with them, where they come up with the questions and we explore them. And so what we've learned over time is that as kids feel ownership and a sense of equality and participatory enthusiasm that they have is generated when they themselves get to propose questions and explore them. And then we model a certain method of inquiry that they latch onto more readily than any adult would. My first book, all the questions were posed and explored by the kids themselves. But again, I truly believe from the Democracy Cafe ethos that the more that we can get young people involved and explore these things in a setting where there's no hierarchies. So it would be in a university, but outside the classroom. In the student center, where they feel it's more like their turf, that's a great thing. So many of our longest running Socrates Cafes at Roger Williams University, Quinnipiac, they're in the student centers, because students, the one that we have now for 18 years at Tacoma Park, Maryland Library is in the children's library section. We adults come in there and we sit at children's size seat. And people with multiple PhDs, they have to bring down their $50 words and put them into 25-cent words so kids can understand. It doesn't dilute or oversimplify. It just means that they can explain their views in terms that a child can understand. Not always possible, far more often than we think. But that's a big part of what an egalitarian inquiry can be, is putting ourselves willingly and regularly in positions where we're engaging with people from many diverse human experiences and ages in settings where everyone can feel more and more comfortable. Again, if you go to our drop-down menu, one of the reasons that the preponderance of our groups are in public libraries across the US, more and more forming all the time, now online through Zoom and such, is because there's few gatekeepers. And librarians are my great kindred spirit, and they truly believe that we need to create these settings where people can engage one another from any and all walks of life. And that in and of itself can foment a more healthy, connected, democratic enterprise.
Yes, Melissa has a couple of questions very specific to the process.
How do you know that a question has been thoroughly discussed in this process? Now I'll go into that a little more. Well, you don't. And that's why we get together again and again and again. These aren't one-off deals. These are regular gatherings. Do
you regularly repeat and have the same question discussed multiple times?
We can. I think that it's like a great symphony. It tends to be theme and variation. But I think even if you look at the questions that were pitched to me and that we explore at our gatherings, they're all connected. They're in some way related to what's going on now, but there's also rather timeless element to them as well. Sometimes, I mean, even if you do it an hour and a half, 2 hours, and people are busy. You've got to make ends meet. Hurly-burly of everyday life gets in the way. They have kids to tend to. If you can give the gift of an hour and a half of your time, that's quite something. And you may just scratch the surface, but you may do so in ways that you've never done before. It may lead, and it typically does based on feedback I've gotten these last quarter century, to continuing the discourse outside of formal settings with your couple, with your family, with friends and neighbors. You might continue the same conversation that you had first at a more formal Democracy Cafe or Socrates Cafe gathering. So the idea is that this question has generated so much interest and curiosity that you want to keep exploring it as you go about your day and week and month. And that the question may, at the most unlikely and unexpected of times, come back again and again and again. Facilitators, you asked, if a participant does not bring up an aspect, does the facilitator bring it up? A facilitator quite often can and does. The main thing is for a facilitator to realize there's lots of other people taking part, and they might well have a better aspect to it than the facilitator does, like you have with me. You brought up far better points than I can. And so I really like to make you feel like this is your gift, this, as much as I can, this is your inquiry. I might teach you some nuts and bolts, and I might give you some terms and history and foundations of this. But ultimately, in order for these things to thrive, everybody has to feel that they're an integral part of it. I found repeatedly over the years that it's the soft-spoken souls who don't even really want to raise their hands, they think it's rude, that I'll sort of pick them and ask them if they also want to say something. And they usually have just these incredibly moving and thoughtful comments that leave the rest of us just so grateful that I asked them to say something. Probably the best role of facilitators to make sure the conversation, discourse, inquiry is well distributed, to make sure that somebody who really likes to hear himself speak doesn't monopolize, because that person loses out too. If he's just there, it can be a sign of actual insecurity if somebody just wants to keep talking, doesn't really want to listen. But it's important to have views scrutinized and to have a plurality of perspectives and considered. It doesn't mean all perspectives, I cannot stress that over much, are equal. Doesn't mean that it's all relative, that all views are right or wrong. No. It means that views can be scrutinized, challenged, further pushed and explored and developed. And that's a lifelong process. And that's why it's something that we continue to do. My second book that came out in English and Spanish, also published by Penguin Random House, was on a day of why. And it follows a day of a questioning child. You know, why are there birds? Why are there words? Why is there why? Why is there sky? And one of you beautifully brought up that one of the most profound questions that we can explore is deceptively simple, that word why. Why do we even have the word why? Those are the kinds of questions that kids ask that keep us adults on our toes in the most wonderful way. And so I do try to include kids as much as possible because they inform me. Now, do your groups have a partisan balance of participants? If so, how are you able to create and maintain this balance? This is another book of mine that just came out not too long ago I didn't like the cover, but that's me, somebody laughing manically. I'm not sure captures the thoughtfulness, but nonetheless. So let's talk about that. One of the ways we do that is to thoughtfully frame questions in ways that don't necessarily lead to partisanship or to revelation of partisan views. And so there's an art to framing questions. And I'll give you an example. I'm so glad you raised that. So for instance, let's say if I had asked the question, should U.S. military troops be involved in Afghanistan? It's going to necessarily lead to it's a yes and no question, and you're going to find people's partisan sleeves very quickly. Either they feel like we should, and they're going to go into why, or they typically feel like we shouldn't, and they'll go into why, and never the twain shall meet, usually. Sometimes that's not true. In our kinds of gatherings, we take pause and say, well, what's another way of asking that enables us to look at an incursion that we're involved in, but also that opens up the scope of it. So we'll take that time. Remember, these are ongoing gatherings that allow us to explore things in more nuanced ways, because we get together for a while, for at least 90 minutes, and even that can fly by. And so when that question was proposed, should we or shouldn't we be at war in Afghanistan or Iraq, I said, well, what's another way we might look at that? The person took a couple of minutes and they said, well, what is a just war? And that was pay dirt. Because all of a sudden people could weigh in on whether they thought we should be at war in Afghanistan or Iraq or Vietnam or anywhere. in the context of their overarching philosophy of what they believe a just war is. And so it allowed for more depth, more nuance, more color of perspective, even if and as there was disagreement over any specific U.S. involvement or in anything. For some people, there was no such thing as a just war based on their religious beliefs. It was a beautiful thing to behold, but just by framing the question, also using this form of inquiry, and I'm going to go a bit into more of the method in just a minute, but I don't believe in talking to you about method until we've actually experienced it a little bit, is that we look at our value systems and we frame questions in ways that allow us to not just share with others our value systems and our philosophical perspectives, but more about what they really are, where we discover more ourselves about what our value systems are. We only discover, and that's a hallmark of our Democracy Cafe gatherings, more about what our views are by having the opportunity to share them deeply with others who are deeply listening. That's a big part. And I'm going to give you an example. This was at Hiroshima Peace Park in Japan. And that's the one building that was left intact after the dropping of the atomic bomb in World War II. And a bunch of adults gathered, and we had, translator. And they asked, well, what is ikigai? And that's a term that means what makes life more worth living. At first, it was just adults. And they said, well, life isn't worth living now because kids are destroying our values. They don't believe in our values anymore. And they forgot all about me being there. They started declaiming kids. Kids are the scourge of society because they're so cynical and sardonic and they don't practice our values anymore. Well, luckily, and the reason I hold these in public spaces whenever I can, a group of kids just came out of the Peace Museum and they joined us. And I told them what we were discussing. And I said, we were asking, what is your ikigai? What makes life worth living? And they said, well, they came from another province. And they said, well, since seeing the horrors of the movies and the photographs in the museum, we've been just walking around asking ourselves, what can we do when we get back home to make sure that this never happens again? And so they began sharing with us older folks these beautiful projects they were going to do to bring about world peace and to connect people. And I share that in my third book, Socrates in Love, this form of unconditional love that kids practice better than anybody. And we adults left more hopeful because we thought some of them thought they saw kids and understood kids in a specific way, but they had that transformative experience and opportunity to view kids in a very different way when we engage them as equals in the context of that question. And so then all of a sudden we're so mesmerized and engaged with one another, partisanship sort of goes out the window for a little while, for lack of a better way of putting it. But a lot of it depends on artfully framed questions and the real sustained attempt to hear each other out and to want to know one another's stories out of genuine heartfelt curiosity. So we do. Here's public libraries are my number one favorite place, community centers, student centers, any place where those, like on a campus, if it's young people where they feel really invested in it and it's a little bit more their turf so that they feel truly as equals, even if it's facilitated by a professor or a series of professors. The one at Roger Williams University in Bristol, Rhode Island, they take turns. 1 week a student will facilitate it, then a staff member, and then a professor will facilitate. And they all propose questions, but it creates that egalitarian sense of camaraderie over time so that this isn't a show, but that this is a happening, an event where people look forward to coming. And if new people come and they quickly see this isn't about having some sort of soliloquy that swirls around me, but about getting my view in, having it scrutinized and shared, but also opening up the space for everybody else, well, you'll see it has a real transformative effect in how we engage with one another and the potential for democratizing itself. So, let's see, does anyone else have any more questions before I go into more nuts and bolts of what this is all about? Sis, you want to say something?
No, I'm good.
You good?
I'm good. Well, I guess I just wanted to emphasize one thing, which is, I I mean, Chris has been talking a lot about this, but children do not have a voice, and this is, I think, throughout the world, but I see it more particularly in Mexico because there's so much violence against children. And, we, like particularly in Mexico, we talk about all the violence against women, but children do not have the means to even bring about or even sometimes be aware that there has been violence against them. So, I mean, it brings me in a position, even with my children, like to know, just like there's power in life, I'm like, where do I stand in life as a woman, as a Mexican woman? Well, how do I stand as a mom to a little child when I, when I, in certain way, I have power over, how vulnerable they are. So to me, all the work that Chris does is also, as he mentioned it before, is to change those patterns within ourselves, to, to question also how do we relate in day to day to one another, if, with our closest, and also in the context of the society and humanity at large.
It's so, and one of the reasons that I decided to call this gathering Dialogue for Democracy. If a democracy means the sustained attempt to give equal consideration to a variety of views on those issues that are most pressing and most impact us, if we become aware just by engaging like this, well, who's being left out that needs to be considered too? What are the power relationships and hierarchies here? Just even that kind of unsettling revelatory experience can make us more willing the next time to make sure that we address that, or in other settings. And so again, this is an ongoing process. Graham talked about, how to maintain balance. And I think of the word equilibrium. How do we have that kind of equilibrium, even as we're impassioned about our views, even as we find repugnant other views? How do we make sure that sometimes I have found that the reason some people yell and scream is because nobody will ever listen to them. So they feel like they got to yell and scream just to sort of vent. And when they realize that it's not going to get any sort of provocative response from me, they settle down. I mean, remember, these are all about habits and traditions, and habits are things that there's bad habits, which we can change, but it's really, really hard. And the habits of careful listening, scrutiny, of artfully framing questions, and developing our viewpoints more than we would in a typical conversation, these are things that happen over time. Sometimes we fall flat on our faces. But it's also that experimental ethos that made America great, was that we try things out, and sometimes they don't work, but we learn from them and we dust ourselves off and we continue. I mean, I still have good dialogues and not so good ones, but that's part of it. Graham has to run to another meeting, so I thank you, Graham, for your participation. But let me, just for those of you who are here, I would, if you don't mind, I'd like to give you a little bit of the nuts and bolts of what the form of questioning that we do and that you've experienced a little bit of amounts to. In fact, and again, you've experienced it because of your own challenging of assumptions, because of the great questions you've posed to one another and here on the chat. You've really hit the head on the nail about much of what we do. It seems simple, but it's actually not. And to do it on a sustained basis takes an extraordinary commitment among fellow Americans who really want to bring about a kind of society that is more open and inclusive. Never once and for all. And I don't know if you want to be totally open and inclusive. That's one of the beautiful points that one of you brought up here. But there's no such thing, folks, as the Socratic Method. I wrote my dissertation about it. Trust me on that. Socratic methods. Some people want to lead you to their way and truth and light, using a form of questioning to bring you to their version of the truth with a capital T, and they consider that Socratic. If any of you have gone to law school or even seen a movie about law school, like The Paper Chase, the Socratic method for them is skewering your views. They'll make you doubt anything you ever thought and just tear away your confidence and your foundations. They think that's Socratic. I don't, or at least I'm offering an alternative based on my own traditions and the way I was brought up by my grandmother on the Greek side. So here's 3 terms I'm going to tell you about that I was raised on, and that to me, if you use any one of these 3 terms without all of them, you're leaving something critically out of the Socratic method. And just to differentiate mine from what everyone else is doing, I call it the Socrates Cafe method. The alenctic is a Greek term that means inquiry, encounter, and cross-examination, all rolled into one. So whenever you do a fellow human being the high honor of asking them follow-up questions to anything they've said out of pure curiosity, you are encountering them, you're inquiring, and you are cross-examining them in the most redemptive and potentially positive way. That's what we've been doing with one another. Now, the other thing is that on an ongoing gathering, one of the things that I still like after all these years is that discovery of something I harbored within that I didn't know I had. The maieutic is a Greek term that means midwife, midwifery. It means giving birth to things that you didn't necessarily know you harbored within yourself. So when you keep asking people out of heartfelt curiosity, why, they might suddenly say, you know, I never really thought about this before, but I just realized I discovered a thought I had that I didn't know I had, or a view I had, I didn't really know I had it. But you're creating the opportunity in a Socrates Cafe or Democracy Cafe for that discovery to take place in a safe space or sanctuary. That element of midwifery where we're giving birth constantly to ideas and notions that we didn't know we had until we were asked to further develop them in the setting. Now, aporia is what law school professors are really good at practicing. It means doubt, sowing seeds of doubt. Now, there's degrees. If you even ask why to somebody who is so sure of their view, that in and of itself might be a challenge to them. Maybe they've never been asked why before. Believe it or not, some people are used to spouting views, but not being able to be asked why. But it's actually a very big compliment to just be able to say, well, what speaks for and against any given way? If they say that I'm for the war in Iraq, can you present an alternative to that that might, at least for a scintilla of a moment, make them question whether their view is really as sturdy as they thought it had been. Again, it's not about stumping anybody. It's about looking at a wide array of ways of seeing things so that when we leave a discourse, maybe we do feel a little more doubtful about a given way, or at the very least, we want to keep inquiring into it. Maybe not, but you don't know until you have the courage or chutzpah to engage with your fellow human beings in one of these kinds of gatherings. Let me go to the next one. So remember, it's about exploration and inquiry versus argument and debate. That is at the heart and soul and crux of what we do. It doesn't mean that there's not elements of argument. It doesn't mean that there's not elements of debate. It does mean that that's not the principal component of what we do. If we tried to be all things to all people, we wouldn't do anything. There's plenty of room and space for debate and forensics. In fact, in many, many places, it's the only sort of engagement in town. We operate from the premise that it's important also to explore and inquire with one another, ideally before we engage in argument and debate. So we'll feel a greater sense of connectedness, because you got to take on these hard button issues. It might leave folks more amenable to coming up with colorful solutions to things that they otherwise might be more intransigent about. That's been the feedback that we've received from people who implement this on a regular basis. And you do that in part by just coming up with questions that don't skirt around issues, that don't leave you walking on eggshells, but that enable you to have both the microscope and the telescope at the same time, that you're able to go deep dive, and also look at things from a distance at the same time. And you're constantly seeking alternatives and objections to any given way of seeing things. You might even have an inquiry where you say, well, gosh, we all seem to agree on everything. That does happen. And so only 30 minutes have passed, and then the facilitator might ask, well, let's just use our imaginations. What are some other ways of looking at this question on war or racism or equality? What are some other ways? Just using our imaginations. What might somebody who's not here with us that you know in your life, what might they bring to the table that we haven't brought? And that in and of itself can serve as a jumping pad for many other ways and avenues and portals of inquiry and knowledge gather. So always be ready and willing to just say, well, let's use our imaginations, put our noggins together for a bit, and think of what are some other ways of looking at this issue, besides those that we already seem to be speaking to the inquirer about. Because that's another actually trap, is if everybody just agrees and without even putting on their questioning lenses and say, well, let's think about this. Let's take this as an opportunity, not just to be a devil's advocate, but to say, well, what are some other ways of looking at this? How might a child look at this? How might a victim of abuse look at this? How might a victim of other forms of violence look at this? How might somebody who's been wronged unspeakably look at this, who's not in here with us, but that I've read about? Maybe somebody I haven't encountered, but I've read a story. How might they look at this whole notion of rights? And that, again, opens up new avenues for inquiry. Once you do that, an hour and a half or 2 hours goes by really, really quickly. There's always new avenues of exploration and knowledge gathering. And please write in any questions as I go through. Now, we talked about, Graham had talked about, we do want to persuade others. And that's certainly a valid point. And there's many, many classes you can take, and I've taught them. I have a PhD in communications on persuasion. What we do at a Democracy Cafe, Socrates Cafe, is we focus less on proselytizing and persuading others and more on persuading ourselves. Now, what do I mean by that? By that, I mean that as you do develop your view and share your view more than you would in a typical conversation, the person you're really trying to persuade that your view holds lots of water is yourself. Use this as an opportunity as people question and non-threateningly challenge your view and scrutinize it. So ask yourself, is this view of mine really all I thought it was? Doesn't make you a flip-flopper. You don't have to reveal to others that you maybe are having some doubts. But once you put the focus more on yourself than trying to convince others, it's still the element of persuasion, but you've sort of turned the tables. And you're focusing on making sure you yourself, that your views that you're espousing and sharing are all that you thought they were, or whether they need tweaking or overhauling. And you're using this as that blessed opportunity to do so. Sympathetic immersion, that's kind of a big word, I know. What it really means is Socrates Cafe and a Democracy Cafe are meant to bring others, you're attempting to do two things. And so you need to be conscious of this, that's what it's about, that you're trying to put yourself in other people's shoes. It's easier said than done, especially if they're presenting any view that you find repugnant. What is their story? How did they get to this point where they have such a repugnant view? I want to know this person's story so at least I can understand. Again, it's a never once for all activity. In my latest book, A Child at Heart, I write about how a member of the KKK, Edwin Wilson, wrote to now the late incredible Congressman John Lewis and told him he was the person who beat him mercilessly when Lewis was a nonviolent activist in civil rights. This man was afraid to write. He had gnawed over it for years. Lewis' immediate response was, of course I forgive you. I forgave you even while you were doing it to me. I mean, this to me is a bar that I strive for every day. The late Congressman Lewis is my hero. He's already had forgiven him. And the reunion between this former KKK member was just before he passed away. Didn't know it at the time, but he ended up not living many more months. And Congressman Lewis, who espoused a philosophy of nonviolence and forgiveness, which was part and parcel of that, was for me somebody representing a standard and bar that I have not met yet in my personal life, but makes me realize what it's possible to be as a human being. And so that resonated with me. You know, Congressman Lewis tried to understand why this person was raised by racists, was raised with a sense of white superiority, felt that way. But he had a notion of sympathetic immersion that he didn't even have to share in that way. It was so ingrained and embedded in his DNA. And so one of our board members is Cornel West. He's one of my dearest friends. And what I love about him is he says, we all have the thug in us. You know, he came from a rough side of town in Sacramento. He goes, I may not ever show that side. But what I'm saying, and one of the reasons he's so open to very opposing and repugnant point of views, just open to hearing them out, is because he feels like he has impulses within him, whether they're ever exercised or manifested or not, that make it incumbent upon him to try to be as inclusive as we can, even if and as we strive to create a world that's nonviolent, that's egalitarian, and that takes into much more fact economic, healthcare issues to make sure that everybody has the outcomes that they deserve. But how do you do that? You can't do it, and you'll never do it 100%. You probably don't want to. There's dyed-in-the-wool racists who are never going to change their minds, never going to change their stripes. But some will. If you can at least create that opportunity or always be there, as Congressman Lewis was, that to me, about being able to understand how somebody does the most unspeakably awful things, well, maybe it's not just their fault. That can be something. So we strive for that, a little bit of sympathetic immersion in everything we do. And so this ongoing process of Democracy Cafe is all about dialogue for discovery. We're further elaborating our values, our virtues, our visions, our sense of possibility for who we can still be if we can break out of the chains that keep us from being unforgiving, resentful to the nth degree, and many other things besides, and often quite understandably so, but how often we're the ones that we're keeping down by not dealing with our more destructive impulses and emotions. It's not easy to do. The only way I know how to do it, I'm not a psychologist, is to do it through dialogue and inquiry on a regular basis. I mean, I'm going to tell you, people have said stuff that have touched my buttons. It may be few and far between, but it does happen. And it makes me realize how human and vulnerable I am. It makes me want to get back up and try again, even if and as I fail. I don't always do well at these things. Sometimes I haven't slept well, or sometimes I've, just had an issue in my life that's been stressful. But we still come to the table. And I always try to ask myself, why is this person being especially agitated or jumping down our throats today? I can't take time out to explore, but I try to be as understanding as I can. But it's always forward-looking. The whole idea of American democracy to me was that our ideals, our vision can change and grow and evolve over time. But if we ever ossify, then we're losing out of that sense of possibility, and that can be the death knell for democracy. So again, this idea is for it to always be forward-looking and to realize that our visions and ideals can change over time. Here's me, younger and skinnier. One of our most popular Socrates Cafes is at Mandalay Bay Casino Resort, where regular folks get together on Tuesday nights and they examine these questions. These kinds of things can happen anywhere. This particular one was featured in USA Today. I was in Soweto, South Africa, Johannesburg, and Pretoria. And one of the beautiful things to me about this becoming a global phenomenon was discovering how kindred the Socrates Cafe way of inquiry is with other traditions, no more so than in South Africa. Their notion of Ubuntu, which, and I write about this in my Socrates in Love book, I am in you and you are in me, is probably at the absolute core of everything that we do. Even if everybody who participates doesn't even hold that ethos. But it's nonetheless at the core of what the Socrates Cafe way is all about. That I have good and bad impulses, that I can't be all I can be unless I also make sure that everyone else can. I don't just do it to live in the now. I do it for my ancestors who never had a chance. I do it for my children whose chance is to come. So it's up to me to let go of certain things, even as I have to deal. When I was there one time during their Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, it was all based on this notion of Ubuntu. I held a dialogue in a house where Winnie Mandela's sister lived that was catty-cornered to Desmond Lewis's home. And he couldn't come that day, but they believe in this notion of reconciliation and truth in a way that, again, almost puts me to shame when I think of some of the things that I'm not able to overcome. And I've never even been wrong to any sort of degree, as some of those with whom I'm engaged in dialogue there have been. And this is Winnie Mandela's sister to my left. She just invited me into her house when I was there. Didn't even think twice about it. But they, again, have this notion of inclusive inquiry that's at the very fabric of what their entire belief system. It's not enough to say what you think. You have to say why you think what they think. They wouldn't call it Socratic, but it's absolutely kindred. My wife and I, for years, have been activists in Chiapas, Mexico. We hold dialogues with indigenous children there. Once again, this circle inquiry where we're all in this together, it's absolutely important for everybody to take part, is part and parcel of what our Socratic, and again, I would never even introduce the notion of Socratic to them. They don't need it. They get it. They get it. It's part of their entire tradition. Before I say another word, are there some questions among you? We've got about 10 minutes left. Anybody want to ask anything either on the chat or just, you don't even have to raise your hand, just throw something out to me here, just take it off of mute.
Chris, do you have a recommendation? Well, no, I have two questions. Let me start here. The framing of this, is there a like group norms or guide? When a person walks into the room, you've put this question out, you've invited them in. Yeah. Do you start with some sort of framing of it? Do you explain this whole Socratic method? Do you tell them what they're about to engage in and then put some parameters and guidelines around it?
Yes, because the whole idea is for it to be an open forum. So for that to happen, there may be, like, let's say a typical group has about 25 members, but in any given week, 5 new people will come in. So you give a sort of preamble about what this is all about. Some people do it differently. There's some facilitators who read a set of guidelines. I tend to just give a preamble about how this is exploration and inquiry. It's meant to be fully participatory. Nobody's supposed to monopolize or dominate. We're supposed to listen carefully, just to get them into the mood and framework of it. And I'll send you our guide that you can share with all of our participants today. Probably every facilitator of our 100 groups probably has a little bit different approach. I don't try to be the Socrates Cafe or Democracy Cafe police where I say, it has to be this way. They know their communities better than I do. And so they practice the ethos. Some of them do have members that if they didn't read a set of prescriptions and guidelines, that some would just trail off and it wouldn't be what it's supposed to be. So it is important to set the tone for what this is all about, either through a preamble. Some people make it a tradition for the first 5 minutes to say, this is what the rules of engagement, or what I would call the protocol of engagement, is all about. And I'll share all of that with you. Claire, thanks for taking part. I see you have to go. Any other questions before I just tell you one little story more? And then I'll let you go. And please, please let me go ahead and go to my let me go. I had scheduled this for an extra half an hour. I'm sorry. So I have much more than you can ever see here. But please stay in touch with me. My email is Christopher_Phillips@mac.com. You can also see me, oops, what did I do? You can also see me on Twitter at Christopher Cafe. On Instagram, I just came to the world of Instagram. I'm at the Socrates Cafe. So please come there. I'm starting to post a lot of our gatherings there. I always post information about our gatherings on our blog website, on Twitter, and on Instagram. So if you go to any of those, if you follow me on any of those, at Instagram, it's at the Socrates Cafe, or on Twitter, it's at Christopher Cafe. You'll get the information. But I truly hope that this is just the first time some of you and I encounter one another, and that we can do more of these, and that you'll take part. And hopefully, you have to understand, I'm not Chris the facilitator. We take turns at our gatherings. Sometimes I'm a facilitator, sometimes I'm a participant. Again, the whole idea is that many people can facilitate these things. I don't think Socrates Cafe and Democracy Cafe would have become a global phenomenon if I try to make it a cult of personality around me. That's never what I want. I want it to plant seeds and establish these groups far and wide. Sometimes you're not going to do as well as you thought or you hoped. Sometimes not as many people are going to come as you thought or you hoped. But for me, whether 2 people come or 5 people or 50 people, I'm there and I show up because for me, I believe it's really important to the democratic enterprise and experience itself to show up. And this is just one of many ways that I do so. There's many other wonderful dialogue, conversation, democratizing groups, and this is one of them. Anybody else? Anybody else? Can I tell you one more little story before we leave? Just a teeny one? Okay, I'm gonna go back. And so this is a dialogue that I also shared in my Child at Heart book, my latest book. I hold dialogues with indigenous children in Chiapas. My wife still go there about once a year. These are kids who can't read, though my wife gives them classroom without walls, and so now some of them can. But we gather with them on a regular basis. And they teach me, they teach us. I'm not Chris, the PhD guy, I'm Chris. And we share food and drink, and we inquire together. And a memorable dialogue was when on my Thanksgiving Day, I asked them, well, what's a good human being? And this child on the lower left-hand corner, Veruch, or Veronica in English or Spanish, said, well, Chris, I can't tell you what a good human being is, but I can tell you what a true human being is. I said, oh, okay. Well, tell me about that. What is a true human being? And I thought she was going to elaborate this list, you know, trustworthy, helpful, friendly, does a good deed, a turn a day, and that kind of thing. She said a true human being is somebody they stand in the plaza 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, selling beautiful hand-woven goods to raise money for their families. She said a true human being is someone who, when I try to sell them something, at least politely says no to me. That was her example of what a true human being was. I said, how's that so? She says, well, so many people, locals, tourists, they just push through me as if I'm not even here, as if I'm invisible. Some intentionally walk over me and push me to the ground. She says, but a true human being, Chris, is like you. You didn't buy anything from me that day, but you at least politely said, no, thank you. Because I'd already bought so many things from other kids. And we formed a friendship that day. And then she began to tell me about her indigenous belief system. They have a notion called Batsilvinik, which translates as true human being. And it's based on this tradition that you're born into the world, all of us as human beings, but you only become a true human being when you recognize everybody, when you treat them with respect and courtesy and dignity. Now here's a 12-year-old child who can't read and has never been in a school, who taught me one of the most rich traditions that to this day I strive to practice. But that's what this form of inquiry at its best can accomplish. And that's why, as you can tell, I've been doing it 24 years and I'm more impassioned about it than ever, because I see the change. And frankly, you see it more in me. I see it mostly in me. They make me more patient, more caring, and they open up my horizons in ways that I'd otherwise never be privy to. And so that's why, among other things, I invite you to be part of this journey. And I hope you found this meaningful.
Chris, I want to thank you so much for taking time with us. And also Ceci, thank you. Gracias. And just to remind everybody, this is recorded. We also have some documents that we're gonna follow up with and some of the links. And we encourage you, if this is a practice that you want to embrace, that you do so. And I know that I have taken away a lot of tips and tools about how to be a true human being. So thank you, Chris, for your time. And
thank you, everybody. Thank you, Leslie, for reaching out to me. I was thrilled.
thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
You too.
Thank you. You too.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
How do we?